remembers the best of IU basketball. Brought to you by Bank One. We're 15,000 people who care. By Waffle House Family Restaurants, where it always feels like Saturday morning. By the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. With Coca-Cola, you can't beat the feeling. And by Bill Hurst of Mitchell Hurst Pincus, Jacobs and Dick, attorneys at law.
The 1971-72 season, my first year here as the Indiana coach, was an interesting one for a number of reasons. And perhaps most of all, the start to that particular season. We played the Australians in an exhibition game in November, a game that we won by 6 or 7 points and had a long, hard struggle against a team that was considerably less than the best that international basketball had to offer at that time, although there were 2 or 3 Americans playing on the Australian team. We then had a couple of weeks to prepare for our opening game with Ball State. It was a game that we were really pushed throughout and ended up winning 84-77. Larry Bullington was an outstanding scorer at Ball State at that time and played very well in that ball game, was a very tough scorer for us to play against, and we followed that up with games against Miami and Kansas. The Kansas game was really my first introduction to major college basketball, where the game was being played above the rim, above the basket, on the boards by players from both teams. When I'd coached at West Point, we usually had to rely on blocking out and keeping people off the board, and 3 of the 6 years I was a coach at Army, a guard was our leading rebounder, simply because we worked so hard at keeping people off the board and then sent our guards to the defensive backboard. When we played Kansas, Kansas had a very big front line. They had a kid named Stallworth who was an outstanding jumper, about 6'6", and then 2 or 3 other really big kids. In a Monday night game here in Assembly Hall, Steve Downing made 4 critical free throws at the end of that game to enable us to win it. But Downing and Joby Wright had a tremendous battle all night long with the Kansas front line on the backboards. And I can remember turning to Dave Bliss, who was our assistant coach at that time, and as you all know is now the head coach at SMU, where they just won the conference championship in the regular season this year. I turned to David and I said, I'll tell you one thing, I'm glad we got a couple of those guys, meaning Steve and Joby, big, tough, strong kids that could go after the ball on the board instead of just relying on a block out and our guards to rebound like we have for the last 6 years. Well, Steve had hurt his knee in the Miami game, and we had been forced to take him out of the ball game and rest him periodically throughout the Kansas game. And it was to be followed, as I mentioned, it was a Monday night game. It was to be followed on that Saturday by our playing against Kentucky in Freedom Hall in Louisville. This was to be Adolph Rupp's last year as the coach at Kentucky. The Indiana-Kentucky rivalry has not been one like Indiana-Notre Dame that has gone on year after year over a long period of time. It had just been resumed the year before I came to Bloomington, and then we have maintained that game as long as I have been here. And this, though, as I mentioned, was the last game that, or the last year that Rupp would coach, and the last Indiana-Kentucky game for him. Kentucky had a really good scorer from Collinsville, Illinois, named Tom Parker. They had a big center, Jim Andrews, who was from Lima, Ohio. The rest of the players kind of centered around these 2 guys, big, strong forward named Larry Stamper and Ronnie Lyons, a guard. We were to play against Stamper and Lyons and Andrews the next couple of years, but this would be the only game that we would play against Parker, who was a preseason All-American choice. We had a lot of thoughts going into that game. It was going to be our first test against a highly rated opponent. Indiana, by that time, are having won 3 games. We were rated somewhere in the top 10 teams. Kentucky was rated ahead of us. Joby Wright did a really good job on Parker throughout the course of the game. Parker was very strong, left-handed jump shooter, played a lot in the key, flashed to the ball. Kentucky did a good job of getting him the ball, but Joby did a better job of defending Parker throughout the course of the ball game. This would be a game that would wind up 72-all at the end of regulation time and would see us again be tied at the end of the first overtime and go into a second overtime before we would be able to win the game 90-89. I think if somebody were to ask me what is the most singularly memorable game and why of the 17 years, including this season, that you've been at Indiana, what would you pick? I wouldn't have to hesitate very long, although we've had an awful lot of memorable games, to simply say that Indiana, Kentucky, early December 1971. And the reason I'd pick it, Steve Downing, after our game with Kansas on Monday night, did not practice Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Went 4 days without any practice whatsoever and played the entire 50 minutes of the game with Kentucky. In that game, Steve was to score 47 points and get 28 rebounds. The most rebounds we've ever had a player get, at least during the time that I've been here. And for a long time, Steve's 47 points were the most points that a player had ever scored for us in a ball game. In fact, only one time has a player ever scored more than that, and Mike Woodson scored 48 against Illinois in his junior year. We go into the game with a lot of thoughts relative to what Steve can do and what Steve can't do. And I can remember him just working like the dickens at the defensive end of the floor, where he's very much outsized. Steve at 6'7", playing Andrews at 6'11" or 7 feet, very much outsized by Andrews, and working defensively, working the board. And then as the game moved along, Steve almost had to walk to the other end of the floor, to the offensive end of the floor. We would hold our offense up, giving him a chance to come down and get in position so we could run our offense. Then Steve would hustle back down on defense. And again, as I've said, Steve did not practice in the 4 days prior to this ball game. We just weren't sure how much he was going to be able to play. There's no way, as an example, that I could have ever said or ever thought or ever imagined that Steve could play all 50 minutes of a double overtime game. The game was a very interesting one for us because it enabled us to achieve an early national recognition for that particular team, one that we thought was important to us as our coaching staff was just entering into its first season here at Indiana. Beating Kentucky away from home was a big game for us. It brought a national attention to us. We had an interesting follow-up to this game with Kentucky. We went to Athens, Ohio to play Ohio University, a team then coached by Jim Snyder, who was an outstanding basketball coach for over 20 years at Ohio U. In fact, he was a guy that had recruited me when I was a high school senior in Ohio. And here we were several years later playing against Coach Snyder's Ohio U team in Athens. And after having beaten Kentucky, we went to Athens and were soundly defeated by Ohio University, a game that didn't even see us have a chance to be in the ball game in the last 7 or 8 minutes of the game. That then was followed, it was a midweek game, by a game with Notre Dame on Saturday afternoon that was a dedication game for Assembly Hall. And it really took on rather bizarre proportions because we did everything right and there wasn't anything that Notre Dame could do right in the ball game. And it was a game we ended up winning 94-29. And most people everywhere across the country thought the game had been 94-92 and that the 29 for Notre Dame had been turned the wrong way. So here we were, having beaten Kentucky, beaten Notre Dame, and lost to Ohio U in the middle. And not very many people even realized that we had lost a game somewhere in there by our beating both Kentucky and Notre Dame at that particular time in the season. We were to go on in that December to be the 4th ranked team in the country, where going to Athens, Ohio, instead of that, we went to DeKalb, Illinois, where we played Northern Illinois, coached by Tom Jorgensen, and were soundly defeated at Northern Illinois to end our rather brief stay in the top 10 for that year, certainly that high in the top 10. The Kentucky game, I think, is one that you'll enjoy, and I think that you'll enjoy Chuck and Joby talking about it as the game progresses. It's a game that was played very, very hard between the two teams, one that was to set the stage for almost every Indiana-Kentucky game that I've been involved with. Very, very hard, tough, and clean play from both teams.